just to give you a plan here of what I'm covering, briefly emergencies in learning, what that kind of looks like. Then going back to the COVID-19 pandemic, thinking about what happened there, and then thinking about learning losses, especially in girls, but not only girls. So as we know, obviously, the pandemic is just one emergency and we're not sure what's going to come up. So we need to learn from what's happened so far to hopefully progress forward, being more thoughtful and planned. So through my research, I've done a lot of systematic reviews, and I'm going to cover that on the next slide to explain what that means. But the big overarching question is, what support was provided to assist K-12 teachers in conducting emergency remote education? And then things like what remote teaching strategies involving technology were used to continue K-12 learning in that emergency situation. I'm going to cover the contextual in a second, but basically we're looking to see what was happening with school-aged students before they moved into tertiary higher education, to look what was happening through those age ranges across the globe. Now, I do have various contextual questions, obviously, we ask in the research, because if we're saying this is the information from the world, we have to know what we're calling the world, or what this information is. Is it just US? Is it UK? Is it Ukraine? Where exactly it is makes a great deal of difference. Now, systematic reviews, this gives you a visual, diagrammatic, pictorial view of what actually happens. So I'm just going to explain a little bit about this. So as researchers, we often go into a particular context. We explore something very small in a way, because you can't always explore very large things or multiple things and do a good job of it. So you explore something, it's like a kind of snapshot of that moment in time. So from that, you get so much information, but it's only limited to that. So when we're looking at things like what was happening during COVID across the world, you have to do a systematic review. And a systematic review is gathering all the information, all those small little pocketed studies, to then get a big picture. So the systematic review, going from the left there, is electronic. It's also a hand search, and we do what's called an inclusion-exclusion criteria. So to make sure we get all these slides that are important, all these studies that are important, we do a very careful, very transparent review by using Boolean searches, going into particular places, databases, and laying out exactly what we're doing. So someone could actually come in and repeat our process exactly. So then once we have all these studies and we realized what's useful and what doesn't come in the scope of what we're looking for, we then do the middle part, which is the data analysis. So there's two parts to that. There's an aggregated and there's a configurative. So the aggregated gives us numbers. So if we're looking at kind of, could be what devices are used, how many, you know, what countries are using this and that. That's a lot of numbers, percentages. So we kind of give the aggregated view of what that looks like. But what's even more important in my perception is the configurative. Configurative review, systematic review, is where you look at all that aggregated information, look qualitatively at all the context, the text that's in there, analyze it to kind of look at the big picture, which then leads to the findings of the new theories. So instead of having that little snapshot study, we're basically gathering all there is and then looking for trends across all these. So it really provides the big picture. Now, I spent time explaining that because it's important for the findings to show you where this has come from. So one of the systematic reviews that led into a variety was from January 2020, that should be, to November 2020. Articles from peer-reviewed journal articles and conference proceedings. Now, we used those because they provide a level of understanding of quality. So the peer review process that they go through provides some quality, and in the databases that they're housed in, obviously, because you have peer review from lesser journals, but they wouldn't be in those main databases. But we also use conference proceedings just for the fact that this was a fast-moving time that we needed to know what there was. And from the research, we found out that during that past decade, and again, sorry for the numbers, and in fact, no, I'm sorry, it was correct. During that past decade, we were looking at emergencies. So not just COVID, but any emergencies that there was. And many were biological, human caused, natural disasters, weather, geological disasters, and you'll be able to see those more on the next slide. But out of all of those, 90% were focused on the pandemic. So this systematic review, again, like I said, we did systematic reviews in different parts across the 10 years, and then also looking very specifically at COVID. So from this one that was that decade, these are the types of emergencies, because people often ask kind of what emergencies does this involve? So you can see there biological, human caused and natural disasters, and you can see how they're organized. And at the end of the presentation, I'm going to actually have a citation so you can see what model we're using to categorize these. But human caused disasters, political, economical, technological, legal, social, cultural, ethical, those type of threats. We're seeing things at the moment as well, obviously with Ukraine, war, refugees, poverty. But the pandemic one was the majority of the studies. That might change again since 2020, obviously, with different things that are happening. But this was just that decade from 2010 to 2020. We found, which was extremely important, as we carry on now, there is a huge difference in what we call online learning and remote learning. And the term that we used for this, for learning during these emergencies, is emergency remote education. So ERE, emergency remote education. This looks very different than what online learning looks like. Very, very different. Online learning is very planned. Students know they're going to be online. Educators know they're going to be online. That they're prepared with all the materials, resources, everything that they need, and the activities planned. Emergency remote education is educators and students doing what they can with what they have at that time. So again, thinking about COVID, this was a very quick, but other emergencies as well, just the same, that they're often going quickly into these situations. Sometimes some emergencies are short in that something happens, education stops for a short while and often has to just stop. And then quickly it's caught up afterwards. But things like COVID, the war in Ukraine, these types of things are actually ongoing, lasting for a long while, that the education can't just stop, it needs to continue. So this slide here shows whereabouts these actual studies that we were examining were from. And again, these aren't selected, these are chosen through that systematic process. So we have countries all over, and you can see on the left there the different classification as well, because that's very important in looking at where people are studying. And there actually is a great paucity of formal research in those low to low middle income countries. And they're perhaps the places as well that need a lot more research happening. Again, that can be various reasons, from researchers in those countries not being able to have the resources or even the financial backing to do that. But those in other countries could perhaps support in that way. We also found out that during these emergency situations, non-internet-based technologies such as radio, telephones, television we use, the majority were internet-based technologies, and those though were split into 6 categories. There were communication conferencing tools, distance learning resources that are free, learning management systems, online workspace tools, social media even, and specific applications. So people were looking at different things, but during emergencies, I just want to point out it's not just internet-based, also those non-internet-based technologies were crucial during these times. The strategies that we used, these strategies include an examination of delivery systems, an investigation of student readiness to learn online, because that was a huge issue during COVID, that many students were not ready to actually learn. They weren't sure what that looked like. And there was development of communication and partnership strategies. And I'm actually going to jump to the next slide now, which actually show a visualization of these. So you can see there, communication, delivery systems, student emergency remote education readiness, partnerships, promoting student learning engagement, and resources. So these are the things that they focused on. Don't forget, this isn't coming from me. These are coming from all these studies we examined, what they were doing to support for the teaching strategies of what can be done, and again, globally. And you can see on the delivery systems there again, radio and television. I'm just going to give you a second just to kind of scan over that. Promoting student learning engagement, that was a big one, for the fact that, again, it's not just on what you have, it's not just the technologies, it's how you support the learners and the educators, which leads then on to the next slide here. So I had another systematic review going back from those earlier questions, looking at how do we support educators? And I had the question once, actually, why is the focus on educators? Because you need to support educators to then be able to support the students in doing their best job. If you're supporting the educator to do their best job, they will be meeting the needs of the learners. And there was a lot here. This actually focused on the time of COVID primarily, but we did look at other emergency situations as well. And there was points here like prior preparation. A few studies focused on that. I imagine if this study was done again in another 5-7 years, prior preparation would be very high. Numbers looking at, okay, what do we do when emergencies happening? Understanding emergency remote education and seeing the difference. But then a needs analysis looking at what actual people need during these times, similar to this study. And then technological tools, frameworks, strategies, equity, and mental wellness. And I want to kind of highlight that mental wellness, because often that's not a main focus, but yet in the research here it shows that mental wellness was very important in that feeling of isolation, mental health and trauma. And going back to the Ukraine, obviously this is very important, looking at that trauma. And for researchers actually investigating or interested in kind of moving into this space, there's a great lot of research on trauma and emergency situations, including war, for both educators and students. So here are some ways to train teachers to conduct emergency remote educations. So what we found here, there was various things that they used. Studies show different considerations how to prepare K-12, remember that school-age students, to conduct emergency remote education in this time. And these included things like training before the emergency, multiple pedagogical approaches, and the consideration of digital equity, thinking about what students and educators may have when they're actually asked to do ERE, and the impact of emergency remote learning on the mental health. So this again brought in that mental health piece. Now I'm going to actually transition. So we had those systematic reviews that kind of gave us those important things in how do we support educators? What does education look like in these emergency situations? Now, the aspect of these systematic reviews were on learning losses. So we looked, and during these emergency situations, whether it's COVID, whether it's because of war, we looked at when those technological strategies were used, what were the learning losses that can actually happen? So the research questions guiding this was, through the use of EdTech during COVID-19, to what extent learning losses were unequally experienced for girls? Again, that's COVID-19, but it's the same as you'll see for other emergency situations. And then what were the factors that contributed to this, in particular for those in low middle income countries? The low middle income countries is especially helpful. So when you're looking at the context, you can picture how you meet those needs, knowing that those in countries with a higher income can be better supported. So this is a critical slide here. From the research, we found that there were 5 main areas where equity had to be really considered carefully. Now, we were looking often at girls on this, but it also affected boys just the same. But the 5 areas here, and I'm going to go into them more on the next slides, but let me give you an overview here. So digital access, this is the obvious one. Do students actually have the hardware, software? But then going even further, because people often think, oh, they've got a laptop, they're great, but that will all depend on the age and the quality of those devices. Maybe they have a laptop they have to share with other people. Do they have consistent internet that's also at a high enough speed to perform tasks in a timely manner? So those simple things of do they have a laptop and do they have internet could mean very different accessibility issues depending on the quality and consistency of the internet. So there's this one, digital access. People, again, I'm going to highlight this, people often think that is the only thing that really matters when you're thinking about digital access, digital equity, but there is a lot more that you can see under here. Digital freedom is especially for girls. So this talks about unrestricted choice in using EdTech, education technologies, and accessing education technology content. So where this comes into play is you'll have countries in the world, Pakistan, for example, where girls cannot always use, and I mean, Afghanistan's a great example at the moment, where girls actually cannot use the internet on their own. They actually have to have a chaperone. Where you might think, oh, that's unfair, we also have to think about the context. Those countries have often the most sexual predators online where girls do have to be protected. It's not a case of, oh, they're stopping from using it and that's not fair. It's a case of let's make sure that they're using it, but let's make sure they're safe. So during emergency situations, this is really tough because, okay, they have a chaperone, but often that chaperone, be it a parent, in the emergency situation, they're not just looking after one child, they may be looking after multiple, or even from different families that are coming in to be supported. So that's something to think about. And again, those kind of policy changes, but also thinking about as a community how you can support each other. So digital literacy, autonomy in the use of EdTech, in that they don't always have to have someone with them. There's a huge misconception that students are great with technologies. You know, younger children, oh, they know what they're doing on technology. They often do know what they're doing on technology when it comes to social media, using it for that social connectivity, but using it for learning, they often are not sure how to use it or don't know whatsoever. So it's important that they're able to use technologies and feel confident. And that includes troubleshooting when things go wrong, having strategies to kind of fix what's happening, even to the famous turn it off and turn it back on again and see if it's working. So digital literacy. Digital pedagogies, this is often overlooked, using EdTech for effective curriculum delivery. So thinking about how to actually integrate technology. So that's an important aspect. And digital design. Who is these technologies, these programs designed for? Thankfully, the conception is changing, that the technology people are people that are male, always wear glasses, sit in dark rooms on the computers. We're moving past that, thankfully, but there's still the idea that we're designing for different populations and often not for girls. So I'm going to go into these now with strategies we found to counteract some of these things. So some things to think about during these emergency situations of how we can support girls and again boys in some of these situations. So digital access. What we need to think there is consider exploring the extent to which learners have that access to hardware, and again that quality. So gender disparities were found in a number of girls who had that access to hardware and their contingency to equally access EdTech at home. And these potential disparities really need to be considered. I had such a sad story that I'll actually share. At the start of COVID, I was in Paris working with UNESCO in March 2020. In fact, February, just going into March 2020. And there were stories of what was happening in China, because we were learning from China. They were the first facing this, having to go online for learning. So we were learning what we could. And there was a very sad story about a family with 3 children. And they had 2 girls. The oldest was a girl, middle was a girl, and then the youngest was a boy. And they had 2 devices in the household. The oldest girl was given the device, then the boy was given the device, and the young girl in the middle ended up actually committing suicide for the very reason that she did not have access to those tools like her siblings did have. So these are not just light things as we see across the world at the moment, especially. We need to be sure that young children have access to provide them an education. They know that many are aware that, you know, they need to be prepared for their future lives. So digital freedom, remembering that's the one where they have to often get a chaperone and things to be online. So social norms and inequities often drive the extent to which girls are given freedom to use and benefit from EdTech. I'll tell you another quick study, which was very interesting. There was a number of studies in certain countries where phones were always taken off girls and given to boys. So there was a pink phone project, which I found very interesting. So what they did is they gave mobile devices to women, but before they did, they sprayed them all pink. And that actually stopped often the males taking the phones away. But that was an interesting one. I always think connects to this. But we have to think of strategies to make sure that those women do actually have phones. Girls are often more likely than boys to become victims of online sexual solicitation, coercive sexting, and cyber dating violence. So approaches to keep safe while providing access needs to be considered. Also a cultural shift in some ways to support cultures in realizing that, you know, mobile devices can be in the hands of women without making them bad women. There was another study which the young girl interviewed said, I don't have a phone because girls that have phone are bad girls. That's, again, we need to think about how we're actually addressing those problems to support access to technologies, the internet, without the idea that there are bad women for doing that. Digital literacy, that's been used quite a bit actually, and there's more focus towards that at the moment, but the lack of digital literacy can be that major barrier to using and benefit from EdTech. To enable girls to equitably use and benefit from EdTech, we need to think by, first of all, acknowledging that these skills and knowledges are needed, and then how to explore further. Digital pedagogies. So recognizing, first stage again is recognizing disparities and aligning digital pedagogies with equitable teaching practices. And also discuss gender discrimination as part of teachers' professional development initiatives. So you can see a lot of this in making people realize, providing that information to show that, you know, they need to pay attention to these things. But issues related to prompting, gender bias, discrimination, and misrepresentation were found in certain digital pedagogical practices. In addition, gender disparities in terms of the available time for studying and level of flexibility in accessing EdTech were also found. This also goes back to the accessibility. Illustrating, though, that these disparities need to be considered. We should recognize them and align those digital pedagogies with great teaching practices to discuss that gender discrimination. And this is the last major one of those 5, digital design. This is often overlooked, and it's a major part, and students know immediately often when a technology or a program is directed towards them or another group of students. So promoting inclusiveness and equity when designing EdTech interventions. So endorse inclusiveness and equity in EdTech design. Those participatory approaches and processes to democratize EdTech design are presented as ways to include girls' perspectives in EdTech interventions, which could in turn increase their engagement and use of an EdTech tool. I've seen a lot of these things happening where the United Nations will have a group of girls actually designing these interventions to make sure that it has them included. So I do want to acknowledge people that supported in the studies. These include, the authors include myself, Katie Jordan, Diane Burke, Samuel Wilson, and Susan Nicolai. So there was a group that kind of identified a lot of this research needed to be done, and this was the BETTER group, BETTER, and that was a group brought together by Digital Pathways Oxford, Oxford University, and the EdTech Hub, part of so the Oxford University were working in collaboration with the EdTech Hub to actually make this happen. And also EdTech Hub actually funded a lot of this research that I've presented today. So the last slide before I go to questions, if anyone wants to take a screenshot or a photograph, if you want to learn more and gain, these are all snapshots of multiple studies here. If you want to explore these further, here is the links and the names of all those, and you can see published in journals there, including NORAG, the BJET, and the Journal of Research on Technology and Education. So I am going to stop here